Stop begging this system to justify our lives. Stop begging this system for justice. When things happen to you, you step up and defend yourself. Just like everybody else seeks justice on their own, just like everybody else has vigilantes, we need some black vigilantes.
So you heard the Black Lives Matter dude, giving a performance, because that's really what it was. It was a performance. You could hear from the cadence in the voice, all of this was a performance to get people for sure riled up. Daniel Penny. So I woke up with a different perspective than I did by watching the news. It was watching Fox News about a few minutes ago, and I heard part of Daniel Penny's interview with Judge Jeanine Pirro. Now, from my perspective, once I learned that Jordan Neely was still alive when law enforcement got there, because initially we were all under the impression that he died right there on the train, meaning immediately during that or immediately after. No, by the time the paramedics got there, he was still alive. And there was something about them refusing to perform CPR on him. So I've always thought, I never bought the racial component I never thought the racial component being as important as both sides actually gave it in criticizing the other side. I always thought that it was a conversation about mental illness and homelessness, and how we view those who are mentally ill and or homeless. They are typically disposable. It doesn't matter if you are in Washington, D.C. I've been on the trains in Washington, D.C., New York City, places all around the country. And so for me, someone who's taken transit for, 20 years or so, I'm accustomed to people acting erratically. I've been on trains where I've been uncomfortable, on buses where I've been uncomfortable. I've never been in a situation where I felt threatened enough to do something or it will intervene, but also that other people were threatened enough to actually intervene. I've been on instance, and most of these are men, and it doesn't matter if it's men. It doesn't matter if it's white, black. There are times where it's gotten very heated, or it seemed very tense on the train, and somebody would say, "Man, get your." Oh, probably shouldn't say that. This is a podcast. Well, they'll have some cuss words. And the person will eventually, as crazy as they may have been in that moment, they eventually move on. I've even been on the trains where women have said things to these same people and they have eventually moved on. So that kind of was my framework as somebody who doesn't talk about people, talk about those who take transit. I rely on it on an almost daily basis. So for me, that's shaped my perspective. But once I heard him say, this is Daniel Penny, that he repeated kind of what I said, that he takes the train, he understands that there are people who act erratically, but this day was different.
Because there's outbursts on the train all the time. Unfortunately, in New York City, there's always people coming on and saying kind of talking crazy, and this was unlike anything that I've ever experienced, and it was very serious. I completely believed what he was saying.
I wasn't there, but there were people who immediately afterwards said they were thanking Daniel Penny for stepping in. And if I got the story right, there was a black person and a Hispanic person, the same people that I thought straight out the gate was like, oh no, they need to be going to jail too. They need to be going to jail too. But they were never prosecuted. So I always thought, well, why weren't the people who assisted him, because this is where my mind was, why weren't the people who assisted him in killing Daniel Penny not also arrested? I need to know who they are. I need to know who they are. Well, there probably was a reason, because there was no justification. And so if you're willing to accept that there was no justification, well, and many people won't be, but we acknowledge that those people who assisted Penny in holding him down in the death that we say he committed, if we can understand why they weren't charged, then we probably should be able to understand why Penny should not have been charged in the first place. Is race a factor? Race is a factor. It doesn't matter what the circumstance is. I think that for us, definitely black people, we bring a lot of our history to the table. So we remember that there were people who justified the death of Trayvon Martin. He wasn't homeless. He wasn't on drugs. He wasn't acting erratically. He was walking from the 7-Eleven with Skittles and an Arizona tea in his hand. And there were a whole lot of people this was during the Barack Obama era too. There were a whole lot of people who justified his death. After the death, the Ferguson riots, who was that? Mike Brown. I remember I can't remember the police officer's name, describing shooting Mike Brown. And Mike Brown, he described him as he literally says that he was bulking up as if he were preparing to run through the bullets. Like some superhero type of villain stuff, like immortal. Black people, we wear that on our shoulders. And so a lot of times it's hard for us to separate these when we see George Floyd, instead of talking about the fact that a jury, even after a jury found George Floyd, Derek Chauvin guilty, there are people who were still justifying George Floyd's death or refuse to concede that Derek Chauvin did anything wrong. Like, we watched that. We watched in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter riot when people like Candace Owens, by the way. Candace Owens, then something that Charlamagne the God, when she was on The Breakfast Club, that he didn't bother to ask her about. But remember, it was Candace Owens who called Ahmaud Arbery a thief. So black people bring this, and it weighs heavily on us, and sometimes it's warranted, sometimes it's not, but it gives us a perspective that we do wear on our shoulders. Now, some people, like Candace in that sense, where she called him a thief, and there were people who were willing, even at that time, to justify the death of Ahmaud Arbery. So, but because we carry that on our shoulders, it blinds us sometimes to not the stuff about where people say, black people don't want to focus on what's happening in their neighborhoods. Yes, they do. I talk to them. I know them. I know the people who have the organizations. You don't see them on the news when there are deaths. There are people grieving in the community. There are people coming in the community to try to bring peace and have just type of community events to bring a sense of self. They have business entrepreneurs, all of this type of stuff that they do in the community that no one ever bothers to talk about, because race is such a dynamic that if it ain't white and black, we typically are not interested. But the Jordan Neely, the Daniel Penny case, and I think it's something that, as I said, I came in with a much different perspective on it. And I even said, okay, well, if they ain't gonna get him on the first one, they gonna get him on the second. So I can see them giving him a pass on the first charge, on the main charge. But then they didn't even get him on the second one. What am I supposed to say about it? I can have an opinion about that, just like people can have an opinion about whether Donald Trump needed to be charged with 34 felonies. I can have an opinion about that. The jury said, just like the jury said here. And the people who agree with the jury decision against Donald Trump, they're not going to agree with the jury decision against Jordan Neely. But there are a number of examples with hypocrisy on both sides of the aisle. And I think in this case, the Black Lives Matter dude, where have these people been over the past 4 years?